Great, thanks. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an intro. I'll do a bit more because I think there will be more people joining. But just to say, this is our third session in NowWhat, looking at healthy human culture. So this body of work that's kind of the harvest of all of my lifetime inquiry, which you could say is, you know, it starts with the question, why do humans not make healthy human culture? You know, even when we really intend to create healthy, positive movements for change, or organizations or groups or loving relationships with our beloved or in our families, why does it so often go wrong? And what does it take to create health? So what can we learn about both systems? And the focus this week is going to be on return paths. So we're going to talk a bit about what a return path is and look at different ones and do a bit of exploration. You know, where's a return path worked in my life? And as ever with healthy human culture, we're going to start by doing a little bit of embodied practice of health. So with the sense that health starts with a relationship, a balance and flow between these two archetypes that I've talked about in previous sessions, strength and love, or outward and inward, or action and rest, with a question, you know, is this to do with our nervous system? So Sarah, I'm going to hand over to. We're going to spotlight Sarah, and she's just going to lead us through a little bit of warming up our bodies and coming into our bodies and evoking qualities of health. So thank you, Sarah, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm just going to lead 5 minutes of embodied practice, and feel free to engage with this in a way that works for you. But we're just going to practice moving between different states, different archetypes, if you've joined us on these calls before. So just beginning by resting back. If you can, lean against something. Might be chair, sofa, floor. And see if you can give your weight to this support. Just allow the support to take some of your weight. You're welcome to close your eyes or lower your gaze. You might want to just take a few breaths, maybe loosen your jaw. Yawns and sighs are really welcome. You're on mute, so you can groan and let go any sounds that might help you to just relax. Notice if there's any tension in your body. If there's somewhere that just needs a supportive hand or a breath. It's what will allow you to soften and settle. As you notice your breath, can you allow your breath to just stroke your heart? Noticing any feelings or sensations that may be surfacing. Just resting back into the archetype of being, stillness, care, and love. And then without jolting or jarring in any way, it's inviting you to now transition into the archetype of outer movement, strength and will. Maybe see if you can take the weight of your body standing or sitting upright. Maybe find some shapes or moves that will allow you to feel kind of stress-free engagement with action. You might want to look around, stretch. Being with the stress-free embodiment of action rather than the emergency state that this sympathetic nervous system state is often associated with. So, yeah, just outer movement, doing, practical, balanced action. So this is how we upregulate our nervous system, moving into the sympathetic in order to get things done, to do the tasks of daily life. And engaging with action with the sympathetic nervous system is fast. Now I'm going to invite you to move back again, see if you can return, move back into resting, the resting archetype. So let go of movement. See if you can feel the support once again. Maybe give up a little bit more of your weight to the ground. Drop your gaze or close your eyes. Coming back to your breath, noticing what's inner, still, connecting with the archetype of love, being, and care. See if there's any tension that you might just be able to soften, just allowing yourself to be received by the support that you're resting into. And dropping into a parasympathetic nervous system state, which is the state of rest and digest, is slow. It's a much slower process. So in this short time, we may not even begin to get it, but this is the way towards it, or one way towards it. And if you were here for a few minutes longer, you might notice your stomach gurgle. Yeah, so just resting. Maybe noticing anything that happened for you, moving between these two archetypes. Thank you, Sophie.
Team. So Sarah, Teresa and Layla, I hope that's okay. Thank you, thank you. So yeah, let's think about return paths. And I think the simplest way that I'm going to go into this is actually just to share again the map that some of you will start to be getting really familiar with. So for those of you that have seen this before, for some people, they say that, you know, each time they see it, something new comes in. Let me just make sure that I've got it open. There we go. And then I'm going to share my screen. There it is. So this title of the work, Healthy Human Culture, How to Create It and Why We Often Don't. You've seen that before if you've been to these. And I really like to preface everything that I say with this is not the truth. So here are some ideas. Every time I do one of these sessions, I feel like I learn more. I learned more about trauma from the session that I did last week. And this feels like a very shared inquiry. For me, return paths are a really crucial part, not only of healthy culture at a small scale, but it also for me is like one of the big questions of our time. how do we create a return path towards health from the level of harm, trauma, disruption, distortion that we have in our world. So this feels like a really important part of the system. So just a little recap about this map of healthy culture. So here's the sort of proposition about health, that health is the balance and flow between these archetypes. And I found this idea of pairs of archetypes that are definitional about what health is in many different cultures or epistemologies. So in my psychosynthesis training, a healthy human being is somebody that has well-developed will and well-developed love. In African shamanic, I came across fire and water in balance. In Chinese medicine, yin yang. In the transition movement, it was being and doing that actually went into unhealth. So here's a proposition: we're healthy as human beings when we have a balance and flow between these archetypes in our life. And not on the map, but you could say around all of this is, what are the practices? What are the cultural rhythms? What are the routines? What are the rituals? What are the habits, whether that's across seasons or across the day, that help us to stay in balance and flow? So we just did a little tiny bit of this with Sarah. We went into a little bit of rest and then a bit of action and came back to rest. And like I said, that's already one kind of a return path. So here's another part of the system that we can go into, the negotiate part of our stress system. So these pink arrows show where more stress is coming in. Our first stress response as social mammals is to try and negotiate our way out of things. And if we do a good job, we'll find a return path from negotiate back to a relaxed, trusting, open sense of well-being with myself, but also with my peers, with my tribe, with my people, with my family, across generations and so on. So here's our first return path. And our ventral vagal, this system of parasympathetic, but with some activation, that's really designed to send lots of energy, lots of awareness to our communication system, to facial muscles, but also to sensing, to listening, to observing, so that we can try and resolve whatever difficulty we're in. So that's our first attempt at a return path. And I think, even this, we could have spent several workshops on unpacking the return path from challenges in our relationship. Does that feel true for anybody? How much do we need to learn about active listening, about apology, about restorative processes when there's been a break in our sense of attachment, when there's been a rupture to our sense of trust? And I'm curious, in my family, we weren't very good at repairing breaks in trust. So there was very little sense of apology or repair. And I've met many people for whom that was also true. We don't have it modeled for us. So actually understanding how to make a really effective apology can be good. And there are other patterns of repair as well. That's not the only one. So if we carry on building up this map, as we get increasing stress, we start to go into emergency nervous system responses. So first flight and then fight. And we may end up in freeze, and our autonomous nervous system decides for us, it's out of awareness, where we need to go in this. It may be an escalation. It may be that we go straight to freeze. And in healthy culture, we'll have these return paths from all of these states. So in a healthy culture, after there's been a big fight, after there's been an emergency situation and we all had to run, or after even something happened and everybody went into freeze, there would be something, I call them social technologies, some kind of social technologies to help bring individuals or groups out of that state of emergency activation. And some examples might be sweat lodges, grief rituals, a group breathwork workshop, a trauma release session. So traditional cultures, Western cultures, modern culture, you know, it might even be some kind of, you know, chanting, ceremony, ritual, meditation. There might be different elements. And I think it's good to say that often in this, once we've got all the way to fight, flight, freeze, it's not just about parasympathetic now, it's not just about soothing, it's also discharging the residue of the flight, fight state. So often, you know, Peter Levine's work in the West talked about the need for shaking or tremoring. But often there's something still in our system that we need to release that requires movement as well as love, holding, safety. So this is my kind of map of what healthy human culture looks like, obviously just one aspect of it, but to do with inner states, stress states, and what happens in the autonomous nervous system. So we're going to keep going and add in add to this map the unhealthy version of human culture. And one way of defining what this is that the return path fails. So one way of looking at whether a culture can sustain health or not is whether it has functioning return paths. Is that true? You know, I offer it to you again as a proposition and a question. So something happens to the culture or to the healers or to the people who have the knowledge and the ceremonies, the return path fails. And now we're in a cultural situation where we have lots of states of flight, fight, fawn, freeze. I've put fawn in as another emergency response. Last time we looked quite in depth at what's happening on this right-hand side of the diagram, how these tend to split and polarize, these upper and lower parts of this side of the map. And then the archetypes distort into unhealthy versions. So we get action and speed turning into kind of manic, mania, avoidance, strength distorts to domination, and so on. And then the lower part, the parasympathetic, the softer archetypes, you know, relating independence distort into appeasement and codependence. I'm interested whether love distorts to collapse and sort of victimhood, you know, and I think it's interesting to think of boundaries as part of the health of the top. So love without boundaries is endlessly giving and it leads to burnout and exhaustion. Is that true? So here's my sort of map of what unhealthy culture looks like, or over on the right-hand side. And my proposition again is that all human systems have all of this in them. So I don't think there's, I don't want to make any sort of idealized or romanticized healthy human culture, you know, that perhaps existed. I think there are cultures that have far more of the left-hand side, and I think there are cultures that have far more of the right, and you know, and the balance is constantly shifting. And every project, every person, every organization has the whole system. And the only question is, what's the balance and which direction it's moving in? And we're going to look at those questions more next week. So if we were to put return paths, the first kind of return path might be from just, you know, naturally arising stress, from negotiate, from flight, fight. A second layer of return path is what happens when there's trauma in the system. Last week we looked in depth at trauma, and I think the reality is once you've got trauma, so once this thing has happened and there's been an experience of the return path failing, finding a return path is a much more complicated process, and that's what we're going to spend a bit of time looking at this week. So here's our kind of intention, session 3, the pattern of return paths. So I can see there's a raised hand, and I just want to say, let's just pause the recording just for a moment. So Yeah, a question about, you know, the difference between pain, hurt, and trauma. I would make a difference. I think trauma is very specifically an injury, so something that causes pain, something that causes hurt, followed by a failure of the return path. And, you know, we looked at that in much more detail, what happens when the return path fails. We'll do a little recap in a moment. Is there a distinction between pain and hurt? I'm actually, can I just leave that and maybe we'll come back to it. That feels like a more subtle distinction, but I think trauma has a very particular anatomy. So we're going to just have a little recap of that going forward. And yeah, let's come back to questions as well when we come to the end of this little bit of presentation. There's just going to be a few more minutes of this, and then we're going to come back together. So the pattern of return paths. So these are these different kinds of return paths. So from the action, strength, outward, speedy, archetype, back to love, dependence. You know, in the negotiate, from where there's been a break, a breach, a stress in a relationship, bringing love and strength, both I care and I have boundaries. So in transactional analysis, that sense, I'm okay, you know, I'm still in touch with my strength, and you're okay, and I care about you, and I care about myself. So we spoke a little bit, I mentioned this, you know, after flight, fight, freeze, physical and emotional releasing, shaking, crying, expressing. And now we're just going to look a bit more detail. What happens after trauma? You know, what is trauma? Why is it more complicated? So if you were with us last week, you might remember this model that comes from Franz Ruppert's work. That after trauma, there are these three parts that are kind of residual. One part is the part that actually keeps hold, that carries the trauma. And the definition of trauma is something that overwhelms the person or the group's capacity to cope and to manage and to process what's happening in the moment. Does that make sense? So trauma is when I'm not just stressed, I'm not just hurt, I'm not just feeling intense pain, but actually the pain is so intense that I can't metabolize it, I can't cope with it, and something breaks down in me. And we looked in much more detail last week at some of the feelings, but here's some of them listed. I feel powerless about what's happening. I feel very scared. I'm in a fight, flight, freeze situation. I might feel abandoned. So there might be a sense that there's no help for me in this situation. I'm isolated. There's not enough resource to deal with what's happening. And there might then be later feelings of, I feel worthless, you know. So after this event happened, there was no repair. I wasn't worth bringing back. And that can leave a sort of residual sense, you know, of life isn't worth living. I'm worthless, the people around me, you know, life is an empty, cold place where bad things happen and there's nothing we can do about it. And this trauma part stays in the moment of the trauma happening, and the person or the group or the culture will find a way of splitting that off so that life can go on. If we stayed in touch with the trauma, we'd be continually in a state of overwhelm, and we can't function in that state. So this second part comes into being, the survival part, suppressing the memory of trauma at all costs. And it will often have a residue of fight, flight, or freeze. So if it has a residue of fight, flight, it may be very overreactive, over-aggressive, go into, you know, picking fights with people or being violent with you know, if it's triggered, if the person's triggered, or very underreactive. So, you know, numb. So something, I'm in danger, but I'm not really doing anything about it. I'm just letting it happen to me. And in that, there are the distortions of the archetype, you know, bullying, passivity, whatever. The third bit of that's residual after trauma, really important, is the healthy part. And the healthy part is the only part that can see what is true now. So the healthy part can see there is trauma. The healthy part can see there are survival strategies that are distorted responses and have a distorted perception of what's happening. The healthy part is in touch with the fact that, as well as pain, as well as overwhelm, there are also resources, there are connections, there is beauty, there is support, there is love, there is strength. So that the healthy part can see and experience and be in touch with the whole of the inner system and the whole of the system out there. And I think this insight for me has been really helpful. The healthy part is the only part that can create healing or change. You know, if we're identified with the survival part will co-opt any strategy in order to keep itself going. That's its job. So if I want to meditate, I need to be in touch with my healthy part for that meditation practice actually to be helpful, or whatever it is. So these are the three parts that go forward. And already I think we can start to see what needs to happen for there to be a return path, is that we need to strengthen and evoke the healthy part of the system and start there in order for there to be a different experience for these parts that are over on the right hand side. So what does that mean? And I would say I've come up with this list from a lot of different inquiries, that there are 5 conditions. You know, I'm really happy for you to have a different list if there's a better list that works for you. But 5 conditions that we need to have in order to start to create the conditions to heal trauma, to repair, to create a return path back to health, so that we can integrate and start to dissolve some of these parts on the right, to integrate trauma and let go of our survival strategies. We need to feel safe, and safety is absolutely central. We need to feel connected with others. So I think it's really helpful to see we can't pull ourselves back from trauma. You know, is that true? There's certainly some things we can do, but I think part of the healing of trauma has to be relational. We need to feel valued, that there's a sense of worth, that I'm worth it. We need to be empowered, and that's very related to safety. So empowerment doesn't mean that I can tell anybody else what to do, but it means I'm both in control of my own experience, and that when I say something, there's a response, there's an attuned response. Does that make sense? Fundamental pattern of empowerment is there's a response from the world that is relevant to what I'm needing or asking for. And there's a feeling of resource, and that resource might be, you know, warmth, shelter, food. It might be time. It might be attention. You know, that feeling of being resourced can come from a lot of things. It might be beauty. So here's the beginning of starting to explore, you know, what creates return paths. And what I would love us to do now, we'll come back to just sharing and see if there's any quick questions, but I'd love us to do a group inquiry and, you know, what's been our experience, finding out what's the experience in this group of actually creating repairs, creating return paths. So I'm going to lead us in a visualization, and then we're going to just do a little bit of sharing. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, sorry, I didn't see your message, Aleki, and I know it is fast, which is totally not how it's supposed to be in a session on return paths. So let's just take a breath together and acknowledge that was a lot. So, and we might again just come back to some of those practices that we did at the beginning, some of the things Sarah said, I'm going to stop speaking, but, you know, inviting you, what helps you to digest? What helps your body to take in information? It might be breathing, stroking, you might want to shake and move. Whatever your body needs right now, let's just take a couple of minutes to do that. So just checking, does anybody need to say anything or just ask anything before we go into a little shared inquiry? And just acknowledging, you know, as soon as we speak about trauma and speak about times when there was no repair, when something overwhelming happened, we may be activating where that is in my body right now. So just, you know, if that's happening for you, just noticing and offering support and care for yourself, and just really repeating that first agreement, self-care on top. You know, if that's enough for now and you don't need more input, you know, you might want to just go for a little wander or turn the volume down a bit, you know, find your way to be with this next bit. So yeah, just checking. Really good to go forward. Okay. So we're going to do this little inquiry, and I'm going to invite you to just choose some situation in your life, you know, where, and we're not going to do the biggest trauma that happened. We're not going to do, you know, the terrible relationship that I had with my mother that went on for years, or, you know, let's choose something that feels like we're going to be able to touch into it and the feelings of it, and choosing something where we feel like there's been a repair, there's been a healing of something that happened, so that the, you know, your relationship to this event or this situation feels like it's fairly well digested and integrated. You know, that if there was a sense of overwhelm, that I'm back in a state of yeah, feeling my capacity, my strength, my growth through that experience. And it might be, you know, one of the things I might choose is, you know, working in an organization where I had a burnout, you know, where I felt stressed and overwhelmed, and I was getting to a point where I was exhausted, but my health is back now. That might be a kind of, you know, some people call that a sort of cool trauma, like a trauma that builds up over time. And it might be that there was a sudden event. I had an accident or an injury, you know, I had a concussion when something fell on my head. And actually all of the shock of that has now sort of more or less worked its way through my system. You know, so just, you know, choosing some event or some situation that you were in. So just inviting you to call something to mind that you feel okay to work with. And we're going to start from a place of feeling resourced. So just putting that situation to one side for now, just noticing where there's places that feel calm, peaceful, resourced in your body. So you might be just checking inside. And actually, as we do that, we might also just look around into the space and just really noticing what you're present with. So maybe before we go inside, noticing what's in the room. If you brought a cuddly something, you might want to have it with you. There might be colors, objects, things that are a support to you. And noticing that in this moment, there's a sense of safety. That feels true. In this moment, nothing harmful is happening. And then we're just going to take time to let go of the outer world. We're going to invite imagination. So again, coming into the body, feeling what supports us in our inner world. So there might be a sense of the earth beneath you, gravity, of being carried by this great being of the earth. Might be that we feel supported by our breath. We might even feel out how our breath supports us to this great system of life on the planet. That here we are, all humans, coming together with this shared intention. There's others who care about this. All of us breathing, feeling how our breath connects us to the great web of life, the green ones, the trees, the plants in the oceans, this great cycle of oxygen and carbon dioxide. And as we breathe in, we might just breathe in that huge web of life that has experienced so much and goes on generating new life, experience. There's joy and beauty and suffering and death, and life goes on, and we're part of it. And our breath connects us as we're connected in so many other ways. And there may be other images or visualizations that create a feeling of connectedness and resource for you. So just noticing how your body feels when it's connected to a sense of okayness. And we're just going to invite a little exploration of the situation that we found earlier. So just inviting you as much as feels good, and we're going to hold on to this sense of now and resource and peace and connection in this time. But imagine that we can travel back, you know, as if we're watching a film, as if we're going back as a witness, and just going to travel back in time to this event or time that you've chosen to explore a little bit. And if there's several coming up, just choose one, doesn't matter. Just choose one situation to remember, to have a look at, where there was some sense of overwhelm, intensity, something really difficult that you couldn't fully handle in the moment. And imagine that you can just look back from outside, looking at yourself, seeing yourself and the circumstances. Who's around you at this time in your life? What were the conditions? What was happening for you? And just remembering that time, seeing yourself in the context of that time, and then just noticing the actual event or the harm, the hurt, the whatever it was that happened that felt difficult, just letting that unfold. You can do it in slow motion if that's helpful. Just touching into that as much as feels okay right now. So if you start to feel overwhelmed, coming back out and connecting again with the resources. We'll see what feels okay to just touch into and remember right now. If you need to, it's fine to open your eyes and come back, touching the physical space you're in. But if you feel you can take that sense of resource with you, just exploring whatever way is good. What happened? And noticing what happens afterwards. This might be a long unfolding situation. So something happened to change that situation, to take you out. And if it was a sudden event or an incident, what happened after the incident? What's happening in your relationships? What's happening in your body? What's happening in your beliefs about yourself or the world? And then we're just going to wind time forward again. And it may be that you're already at that moment when there starts to be support and repair, healing for this thing that happened. So just starting to contact that part of the journey, of the story. And again, just noticing, what were the conditions? What was the context in which something changed, in which healing started to be possible, in which a repair started to happen. Just sort of feeling that sense of the return path. We're starting to move back towards more health, more wholeness, integrating the experience. So just really letting yourself notice what's around you, what's helping, what's necessary for this movement back towards health. And you may want to track how things changed in your body. It's totally fine to use your hands to support any parts of your body that might want soothing or a little bit of attention or comfort. How do your beliefs about the world, about yourself, change as this repair happens, as you travel this return path? And what else changes in you? What else changes in you? And it might be also, what changes do you make in your life as a result of this? So just watching this series of events. I don't know how it is for you, but just letting it unfold. Noticing if there's anything that you want your present self to remember as we come back from this. Is there some learning or insight that's useful to bring back? And then we're just going to wind time forward again and come back into the present moment. You're finding your own way to do that. Coming back to the present moment and just fully coming back to this body, this breath, this room, this space. And you may again just want to feel, give your body a squeeze just to really feel fully present, or take a deep breath. Look around using all our senses to notice, oh yeah, I can put my hands on my desk, you know, I can see the color of the walls. There are certain sounds, you know, there's the Zoom, but there are other sounds. I can feel the texture and the warmth in the air. So we're really using all our senses to fully come back into the present moment. And finding that sense of, in this moment, I'm safe. Nothing harmful is happening to me right now. Wonderful. So we're going to move to a break in a moment, but it would be lovely just to do a little bit of paired sharing, just so we get time to digest and catch anything from that before we go to a break. So is that okay for everyone to? We're just going to have another maybe 10 minutes together in the break, before the break. So 5 minutes each way in a pair, just to speak about how that was.
Sophie, Sarah, and Leila, would you like to be part of the breakout rooms as well?
I'm fine to go in, whatever works for the numbers, Teresa. So let's have pairs. I think that probably will work if we're all in. That would be great. And we might just stop recording now as well. So yeah, my sense is that the understanding of these return paths has been really evolving fast in the West. I don't know if other people agree with that. I feel like our understanding of trauma, of what it is and what's needed to heal it, has really changed. You know, I did a therapy training in about the year 2000, and there wasn't anything about somatics, about trauma and somatics. All the Peter Levine stuff, all the, you know, somatic experiencing itself built on body psychotherapy. You know, there's a lineage behind that work. But I feel like all of that has really come along in the last 20 years, and it's still evolving really fast. Does that feel true? Thank you, Tina, for letting us know. So yeah, and I feel like the evolution at the moment is into cultural somatics. So, you know, there's so much coming on stream about black body, white body trauma, you know, the trauma around colonialism, around race, but also trauma around gender. So understanding that we're sort of that we learn through our bodies how to inhabit our place in traumatized cultures. And for me, part of the intention of this work of healthy human culture was to start to make the links between what I'd learned as individual understanding, so understandings of individual psychotherapy and why individuals do things that are not in alignment with their intention, and to bring some of those understandings to a much wider field and to the human nature relationship, to the human beyond human. So how can we apply some of the insights around, you know, what I learned as the unconscious, but what I now would frame around trauma? How can we bring that to our understandings of why do we create systems of harm that span continents and that span, you know, huge groups in society, like gender or wealth inequality or ability and disability or homosexuality and so on. So our last little bit, the last bit that we're going to just inquire into is about, you know, if I just go back to sharing my screen for a moment. Let me just find the right place. Yeah. Just coming back to this, this map. So, you know, here's the map. Oops. So yeah, this, for me, this is like our big question. What are the return paths from traumatized culture? So when it's not just an individual that's gone over to the right-hand side, and not just an individual that has those three parts of, there is the place where the trauma is held, where the trauma goes on forever. There is this place of the survival structures, and there is some health in the system. But when we have a whole culture where at least part of the culture is being organized by the trauma, so you could say over on the right-hand side, underneath and usually out of awareness in the culture is the experience of cultural trauma. So, you know, that time when colonization happened, you know, when there was a natural disaster and all of the healers were wiped out, or the elders were wiped out. You know, when there was a war, when there was a process of you know, destruction or a Holocaust or whatever it was, genocide. I mean, colonialism is the one that is so clearly an export of traumatized systems to other parts of the world, and how much as part of colonialism, the indigenous structures of healing and cultural repair were destroyed. So we spoke about it a bit last week. So now we have a whole culture that's organized by flight and fight. How do we bring a culture back from that kind of state? And that's really the sort of situation that we're in now. Let's just see. I think this is a really helpful insight, is that different parts of the system need different things to create a return path. So, you know, if we imagine the people who are most identified with fight flight, with strength, with the archetype of distorted strength and capacity, what they need most is to connect to love and vulnerability. Does that feel true? You know, if you're inhabiting a distortion of that top archetype, actually to come back into balance, we need to find a way to reconnect with the heart, with vulnerability. And yet, you know, the people that are most identified with that, you know, and you know, for me, someone like Trump is very clearly in that strength without empathy, you know, the right to take what I want without any consequences. How do we get somebody like that to see their need to reconnect with empathy, with heart? Let's come back to that question. You know, those people that are most identified with, and I don't mean just vulnerability, but with a sense of paralysis, a sense of having given up on their capacity and their strength, you know, need to come back in touch with the ability to set boundaries, the ability to have capacity. So sometimes, you know, I can find it in myself, the part of me that feels like a victim, that feels like there's nothing I can do about the situation. But actually, when I reconnect with health, the healthy part of myself, I see that actually I can do something. And I just want to name that this system creates the real experience of powerlessness for many people. You know, it's not just a role and an archetype in a sort of collective psyche. This bit on top, as we can see happening in the world, is very good at grabbing resources, taking resources, having the weaponry, having control of the media, having a powerful voice. So, you know, the question, where is there real helplessness, and where is it a position that we end up in, is a really important one. So, you know, that this is the kind of idea of all of this teaching, is what helps us get back to strength and love in balance and health. You know, and the teaching about the archetypes, that, you know, one of the things that I saw, for instance, in the transition movement, was a sense of action, action, action. It felt like there was a huge amount of fear driving speed, the sense of urgency, that actually created a culture of burnout. You know, so I would say in that movement, there was lots of health, wasn't that there wasn't health, but there was a tendency to focus on the outer, to go too fast, and to not notice when those people who were more able to experience and feel the vulnerability were burning out. So the remedy in that was to try and bring more qualities of love, more connection to vulnerability, more Joanna Macy work, and just bring more heart into the places of action. So at the end of this, maybe you were hoping that there'd be a sort of solution and the sort of, answer to the $50 million question. And I don't know that there is one. I think it's really difficult to get the people that are most identified with the top right to sit on a cushion and feel things, or to come into a workshop, or to change the ways they do that. And, somewhere increasingly, either they, the consequences of their loss of contact becomes an experience of pain, and the destruction of that system is becoming more and more obvious, isn't it? At a certain point, the consequences of that are unavoidable. But our last bit of time together is just going to be exploring, where do we see movements, interventions, things that are making a difference? And, do we see those things embodying any of the principles of healthy culture? So inviting us, maybe we share, just if anybody wants to speak about any of those, but we also might gather them in the Google document. So let's just take a moment to, imagine and to look around. Where do we see interventions at this much bigger level of scale? Where do we see people trying to heal the system, trying to create a shift in the culture? Who do we see doing that? Or how are you part of doing that? Because I imagine everybody here in some way is actually part of possibly many systems that are doing that. So it'd be lovely just to hear some of what's already happening. And maybe we just stop recording.